All right, diving into something pretty fascinating today, huh? Faith, how we feel, how we handle stress, all that good stuff. And you guys sent in some seriously interesting stuff looking at research from, well, we've got Iran, Turkey, alongside like the bigger ideas in Islam about, mental well-being.
Yeah, a real mix. We've got this 2014 study straight out of Iran, looks at how fasting, like during Ramadan, it impacts mental health. Then there's this broader look at like Islamic practices and how they can be tools for managing stress. And to top it off, there's this really recent 2024 study. This one's from Turkey, and it digs into how Muslim managers, people dealing with like work stress every day, use their faith to kind of navigate all that pressure. So yeah, quite a spread.
And I know our listeners, they want to get the good stuff, the insights, without getting, lost in the details. That's what we do, right? Pull out the gems, the really useful stuff, without making your head spin, right?
It's exactly. No information overload here. So today, it's pretty simple. We're looking at how Islamic faith and these practices can play a role in mental health, how they can be ways to cope with, well, the stuff life throws at you.
Right.
We're talking everything from like specific religious practices to how faith is being integrated into mental health care. Pretty big, right?
Absolutely huge. So let's jump right in. First up, that 2014 study from Kermanshah, Iran. This one was all about what happens to people's mental health when they fast during Ramadan.
Right. And it's really cool how they approach this, I think. It's what they call a pre-test, post-test design. Basically, they checked in with 110 residents, got a baseline for their mental health before Ramadan, and then like followed up afterwards to see if there were changes. And for this, they used this questionnaire, the General Health Questionnaire, GHQ-28, which asks about, well, how you're feeling, different aspects of well-being.
And they weren't just looking at anyone, right? There were some pretty specific rules about who could be in the study.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They didn't include folks who already had like physical health issues or were taking meds for mental health. Same with anyone dealing with addiction. Plus, you had to have fasted for at least 21 days to be in this study.
So pretty strict, but I guess that makes sense, right? Makes the findings more reliable.
Totally. It helps isolate the effects of the fasting itself. And when you see what they found, it's pretty remarkable. Overall, there was this definite improvement in the general health scores of those who fasted. Pretty cool, right?
Yeah, that's significant for sure.
Definitely. And when they look closer, different parts of that GHQ-28, they saw these positive shifts in some key areas. Less somatic symptoms, stuff like, random aches and pains. Less insomnia, less anxiety. Even felt better socially, like handling those daily interactions, no problem.
Wow. So feeling better physically, sleeping better, less anxiety, more connected socially, all linked to fasting, at least in this study.
That's what the research suggests. But, and this is important, they didn't see a big change in like severe depression or suicidal thoughts in this group.
Important distinction for sure. So overall well-being, specific improvements, but not a direct link to those more serious mental health issues, at least not in this research. So what did the researchers say, like their conclusion from all this data?
Basically, they were like, hey, fasting seems to have a real positive effect on mental health, at least in the folks we studied in Kermanshah. They even suggested that we, like as a society, should pay more attention to how fasting could benefit people's well-being.
Fascinating. And how does this connect with the broader Islamic perspective on fasting?
Well, if you look at the bigger picture, Islamic teachings often present fasting as something good for the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. There's this focus on self-control, mindfulness, even this idea that it can make you more efficient in other areas of your life. So this study, in a way, supports those traditional beliefs about the benefits of fasting.
Interesting. Okay, that's a solid look at that study. Let's shift gears now. Our second source, it takes this wider view. It's all about the Islamic perspective on how practices, like prayer, fasting, reading the Quran, how those can help manage stress.
Yeah. And what I like about this one is that it lays it all out, explaining what stress is and how it can mess with you mentally and physically. It says like, hey, some stress is normal, part of life. But when it's constant, when you don't deal with it, that's when it turns into anxiety, depression, even heart problems.
So it acknowledges that stress is a real deal, impacting health. Then it goes into how Islamic practices can help. Let's start with prayer, Salat. How does the source frame that as a stress management tool?
So it points out a few things. First, prayer gives you this inner peace, connects you with God, which would be super comforting when you're stressed, right? Then praying forces you to focus on the present moment, so it's like a mental break from your worries. And lastly, the actual movements of prayer plus the recitation, they have this calming effect on you, like physically and mentally.
Yeah, I can see that. It's spiritual, it's mindfulness, and it's physical, all working together.
What about fasting? Beyond the study, how does this source connect it to stress management?
This one really digs into the mindfulness of it all. Being so aware that you're not eating or drinking. This pushes you to reflect on what you do have, builds gratitude, and it fosters patience, self-discipline, empathy. Like you understand what it's like to be hungry, right?
So it's not just not eating, it's the mental and emotional stuff, building resilience against stress. And lastly, reading the Quran.
Right. Reading the Quran, it's presented as a way to bring calm and tranquility into your life. The source suggests reflecting on specific verses, those that talk about stress, patience, trusting God, like finding comfort and guidance when things are tough. It's about finding solace in the text itself. And they touch on something a lot of us struggle with, I think, that link between stress and overthinking. How does faith play a role in that, according to this?
This part's interesting. It's this idea that strong faith can break those cycles of overthinking. But giving you meaning, purpose, by, encouraging you to rely on a higher power, it can help quiet those worries. It's like you're not alone with your anxieties.
Makes sense. And even though, these Islamic practices are central here, it's cool that they also mention other things, exercise, relaxation, having hobbies. It's like prayer, fasting, reading the Quran. They're extra tools in your kit, right?
Totally. It's not, this is the only way.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like, here are some really powerful additions to how you approach well-being.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so that leads us perfectly to our third source. This one gets into how to actually integrate Islam into mental health care, which is huge, especially given the, massive and growing Muslim population worldwide.
Right. If we zoom out, this source is all about how we need mental health services that are sensitive to, the culture and beliefs of Muslim patients. It highlights that huge global Muslim population, how it's going to keep growing. And it stresses how important religion is in their lives, how we can't ignore that when thinking about mental health. This is where that biopsychosocial model comes in.
And this source clears up some misunderstandings about the history, too. It points out that, contrary to some Western views, Muslim scholars actually recognize mental illness as having, physical causes pretty early on.
Yeah, this historical context is fascinating. It mentions that the first ever hospital just for mental illness, it was in Baghdad, way back in the 8th century, founded by this physician, Al-Razi. He and other scholars back then, they saw mental disorders as medical conditions, things you could treat with therapy, with meds. And that's really different from what was going on in other parts of the world at that time.
Huge difference, a really important correction, I think. And there's also this really practical stuff for healthcare professionals, working with Muslim patients, like how to manage medication during Ramadan, being aware of, say, pork products and meds, stuff that's forbidden in Islam.
Absolutely crucial, adjusting when meds are taken to work around fasting times, finding alternatives if you need to take them often. That shows you understand, right? And knowing that some meds might have, say, pork-derived ingredients and being open about that with your patients, that builds trust, makes sure they're comfortable with their treatment.
Totally. And then it goes into all these different ways Muslims might seek help, from, imams to more traditional healing practices, even Sufism.
Yeah, it highlights all these different paths people take. You got imams knowledgeable in Islamic teachings. They often offer counseling on family stuff, social issues based on the Quran. Then there's traditional healing, which might involve, figures like sheikhs or peers. They might explain illness as spiritual forces at play. But the source does point out that the evidence for this in serious mental illness is limited, and not everyone agrees with it.
And then there's Sufism, right, which takes this more spiritual approach.
Exactly. Sufism is all about, detaching from the world, getting closer to God, often guided by a leader. And even scholars who might be hesitant about traditional healing often recognize Sufism as a legitimate and valuable form of Islamic guidance.
And there's this growing interest in Islamic psychotherapy, right? What does that involve?
This is where things get really interesting. This is about combining Islamic views with evidence-based therapy from the West. So you might see therapists using Quranic stories, metaphors, references to the Prophet's life, even biographies of his companions in therapy. It's all about creating a framework that resonates with the patient.
And they talk about adapting Western techniques, right? Making them fit better with Islamic values. Any specific examples?
Tons. Take motivational therapy. It might be adjusted by using Islamic teachings that stress, the importance of addressing personal struggles as part of your relationship with God, or group therapy. You might see things like gender segregation, a focus on shared values. But maybe the coolest adaptation is in cognitive therapy. They're actually replacing some of those Western concepts with, well, similar teachings from Islam.
And the research actually shows that these adaptations work, right? They've seen good results with things like anxiety, depression, grief.
Absolutely. And it even gives examples of how, these ancient teachings can help with negative thoughts. Like there's a verse that says hardship is always followed by ease. That's powerful stuff to fight hopelessness. And another one, it basically says, don't lose hope in God's mercy. Really helpful in therapy.
So cool how they're bridging that gap, old teachings meeting modern therapy. And this source goes even further, right? Illustrating how Islamic principles apply to all these specific mental health issues, depression, anxiety, grief, even, what was it, wasaways?
Yeah, that's OCD.
Hmm.
And this section really gets practical. Like with depression, they focus on maintaining hope, trusting God. With suicide, which is forbidden, there's also this understanding that, people with really severe mental illness might not be fully accountable for their actions. With grief, it's all about patience, accepting God's will. And with anxiety, it's trusting God's ability, seeking help from Him. And those obsessive thoughts, they're often seen as whispers from, bad influences, with guidance on seeking refuge in God.
They even touch on substance abuse, right? Where Islam's stance is super clear. And smoking, views on homosexuality, the importance of family, even the history of using music and like contemplative practices in Islamic healing.
It's really a full picture. It shows how rich Islamic teachings are and how relevant they are to how we feel, how we cope. Really underscores how crucial it is for healthcare providers to be aware, to be sensitive.
For sure. And lastly, let's get to that 2024 Turkish study. This
Yeah.
one was all about how Muslim managers dealing with work stress use their faith to cope. I mean, work stress is pretty universal, right?
Oh, yeah. This one was qualitative, so it wasn't about numbers. It was about deep understanding. They interviewed 19 managers in Turkey, got all this detailed info about their experiences with stress, and they found 6 key themes.
And one of them, central to our whole discussion, was the role of Islam in their lives, specifically how they used it to cope with work stress.
Right. Their religious beliefs, they actually influenced how these managers understood stress and what it did to them. And that understanding shaped how they dealt with it.
So their faith was like this lens they saw stress through, and that changed how they reacted.
Exactly. And the researchers, they say Islamic teachings offer this well-rounded approach to stress.
Yeah.
It addresses the mental and emotional stuff and the physical. They even pointed out that the discipline of time management, from those daily prayers, can actually help regulate stress.
That's so interesting, like the routine of religious practice having a real tangible benefit. It's cool how intertwined faith and coping mechanisms can be.
Yeah. And for you listening, no matter what your job is, what you believe, this idea that your deeply held beliefs can be a powerful way to deal with pressure, that's valuable.
Totally. So to recap, we've seen that study from Iran suggesting fasting can be good for mental well-being. We've looked at how prayer, fasting, reading the Quran, how they're tools for managing stress. We've learned about how important it is to bring Islamic faith and values into mental health care. And we've seen how, for those Muslim managers, their faith was a lifeline when dealing with work stress.
And this brings us to something to think about, something to consider as you go about your day. Think about the ideas we've talked about today. Being present, disciplined, community, having faith, believing in something bigger than yourself. These popped up over and over. Ask yourself, how might these principles, no matter your beliefs, be relevant to your life, how you manage stress, how you approach your well-being? Maybe, just maybe, reflecting on those ideas, on their potential, could offer you a more balanced, more resilient way to face whatever life throws at you.